G'day, you nine. I thought we'd do a quick little rundown of the pathogens, these disease-causing agents to help you with your work. Um, so essentially, disease is described as a condition that impairs our normal function. So if we're at ease, we have all our internal metabolism working within normal ranges. So it's called homeostasis. But when we get ill, that ease is lost. So it's a dis-ease. Um, and many of these diseases are infectious. So obviously COVID-19 is an infectious disease caused by a pathogen called a virus, which is a non-living pathogen. And some of our diseases are non-infectious. So you might inherit it from your parents. It could be a genetic thing. It could be by bad diet. You could have an accident and break a bone. All these things are diseases, but not caused by a pathogen. So we're looking at pathogens today and infectious diseases. So pathogens fall into two big groups. There are those that are cellular, so living things, and my head's in the way there. We can see lovely bacteria underneath my head. If I can move my head. Get out of the way, Gary. There we go. So here's a nice cellular. This is what we call a prokaryotic cell. The interior is just a whole lot of stuff, and there's no organelles, cell parts organising things. It's just everything drifting around. Huge lipid DNA. This is a living thing. So a worm lives in your gut. Isn't that wonderful? Attaches itself with these horrible looking things to your side of your intestine. And this thing here is a virus. So this is not cellular. It doesn't have membranes. It's quite different. But it does have some nucleic acid, either RNA or DNA. So we'll have a look at each of these in a little bit of turn time. I'll see out the way again. Get out the way, Gary. So get in the way. So bacteria, we call them prokaryotic. We are what we call eukaryotic because our cells do have organelles and our DNA's inside a membrane, membrane called a nucleus. We can classify bacteria based on a whole lot of things. Well, the first test they normally do is a Gram stain test, and that divides them into positive and negative and tells you which sort of antibiotics you can use. We also look at their shape, so cocci, circular, little spheres. There's a rod-shaped one. There's some spirochetes. There's spiral-like ones. What they eat, whether they need to be in an oxygen-free or oxygen-rich environment, how they move about. Do they use cilia or tails, whatever? So lots of information about them. And all that information tells us how to treat them, which is really useful. So often they'll take a biopsy or a blood sample and try and work out what you got. And really, we don't get sick because the bacteria is there. We get sick because the bacteria is pumping out all its waste. And that waste is toxic to us, and that makes us ill. And there's some pretty classic examples. Tetanus, typhoid, tuberculosis, things we hear about. Bacteria are reasonably straightforward to deal with because we can use antibiotics. Because they're living, we can attack them and kill them with chemicals. Not so easy for viruses. I'll rip through some of these other ones because they're not as important to you guys. This is more just general knowledge for you. We have things called protozoans, which are sort of single-celled living organisms that are eukaryotic. So you can see that picture there. There's organisations don't happen. There's cell parts appearing. And three groups of the protozoans, and these things live in water, cause disease. There's the flagellates, so they have a long tail to swim around with, a flagella. Sleeping sickness is one of those illnesses caused by them. Sporosians, so there's spores, they use spores, such as plasmodia, which causes malaria, and sarcodians, which produce amoebic dysentery. So I can't remember what the sarcodians, why they're different. They're different to the flagellas. They haven't got a tail. Maybe they're covered in cilia. Can't remember now. Again, they can be treated. You can actually find ways of treating these things. And they have life cycles. So the best way to treat them is, of course, to break up the life cycle. So the mosquito is one of the carriers. We and the mosquitoes are carriers of malaria. If we can cover ourselves in repellent and clothing and mosquito nets and stuff, then we stop the mosquitoes biting us, and that actually can stop the malarial life cycle, and that helps cure them. Unfortunately, once you've got malaria, you're stuck with it. It's one of those things that's hard to get rid of. A friend of mine at the zoo is suffering with that now. Fungi also cause many diseases, but we also use fungi for all sorts of things too. We eat them. We use them to make food and cheese and beer and all sorts of stuff. and we use them for medicines. But many of them cause disease. Many of them cause disease in plants, so I'm not too worried about those at the moment. But in us, the common ones are tinea, ringworm, and thrush, and none of them are life-threatening. They can cause a fair bit of damage if you don't treat them, and you can treat them and kill them quite easily, but they are, they cause a disease. You're actually unwell while those things are going on. We also have lots of worms that love to infest us because these essentially are parasites. They find our gut a wonderful place to live because it's full of food, it's full of water, it's nice and warm. It's a great place to live. And so they use all these horrible teeth-like things here. These are hookworms here. These massive hooks around the mouth. They hook onto your intestine. This is a roundworm that uses this, again, its mouth structure to hook onto your intestine. These are worms leaving the anus of somebody. So there's another life cycle. They leave you and come back. So there's many worms that we can consume, and they all, well, we've probably all got worms in us right now. It's when there's too many of them, when this flora becomes out of whack, that they make us ill. There's too many, and they're draining our energy because they take our food from us before we get it ourselves. And again, they release their waste into our gut, and that's toxic, and that makes us unwell. But again, we can treat them. And then there's little arthropods like these ticks in the photograph there. So here's a tick before it's fed, and here's a tick after it's been feeding for a couple of hours on your body, and it's filled itself with blood. So they just grow like that while they're living on the individual. So the same thing with leeches. They'll start very small little black worm-like things, and by the time they've been on your skin for a few minutes, they're huge. Arthropods also attack plants, but we're at the moment concerned with all these ticks, mites and lice, which attack us. And again, they cause skin irritations, they cause fevers. They don't tend to cause death or major damage, although there is a tick that does do that. And then there's the viruses. Now, these are non-living. These are much harder for us to deal with because they're not a living thing. You can't kill them because they're not alive, right? So you got to try and control the way that they get into your body. So we're all, well, we're coughing into it there, aren't we? And we're washing our hands. We're doing all that sort of stuff because that stops them getting into our bodies. They attack both plants and animals. We have some that contain DNA and some which contain RNA, so we call those retroviruses. But as you'll remember from doing the cells, you need both DNA and RNA to be able to copy yourself and to make the proteins that run your body. So they need our cells to complete their life cycle. So they they're parasitic in that sense, but they're not living, which makes them harder to deal with. And then there's these wonderful little things called prions. And here's a prion. This is the prion here. This is a representation of this protein structure of a prion that causes Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease or mad cow disease in cattle. And it's quite a complex structure. It's only a small protein. Proteins get big. These enter our nervous system and make their way to the brain and cause a whole lot of degeneration of the brain. So you lose brain function and you go mad. Dementia and madness follow, hence mad cow disease. How do we control these pathogens? Well, it's not too difficult, really. We've got a whole lot of chemicals we can use. We can, washing, being careful with coughing and sanitation, washing our hands, washing surfaces. Antiseptics will kill pathogens. So you apply those to the skin. You might, gargle your mouth with some antiseptic. Be careful which ones you use, of course. There's some that are made for that purpose, not others. Disinfectants are used to apply to surfaces, and they will also kill pathogens. And of course, we have a whole range of antibiotics we can use to kill bacteria, and a whole range of new drugs, antimicrobials that will damage also those little microbes like the protozoa, fungicides that kill fungus, anti-protozoans and anti-helminthics, which are anti-worm drugs. And in recent years, there's been a lot of work done on antivirals. So these are drugs to try and kill viruses, which is a much harder thing to do. What they essentially do is they block up the attachment sites for the virus so it can't enter your cell. They have to enter the cell. So if you can close up the way they do that, then you can actually stop the virus getting in the first place. And that's me for now.